So the talk title is the epidemic of loneliness, or the loneliness epidemic, something like that. So I'd like to focus on that particular thought, and it brings me to a time many years ago when I was in a major life transition, and one night, it was a cold, dark winter night, feeling very lonely, feeling very alone, and it was quite painful. And I just, I'm not sure why, but I began to think about, well, I wonder how many other people are experiencing the same thing I am. So I just sat and opened my mind and opened my heart, and I could sense that I was not alone in my experience, and that I just felt like I got in touch with many, many other people, millions of other people on this planet that were in prison or in the military or in nursing homes or at their own home or wherever they might be, that are experiencing loneliness in some form. Interestingly enough, after doing that for a few minutes, I wasn't lonely anymore, and I felt, paradoxically, a connection with all of these other people in the experience of loneliness. So any experience can take us home. That's one of the key teachings of this practice, is that any and every experience is a potential vehicle for bringing us home. For whatever reason, I seem to have come across several books and studies in the past few months on the topic of loneliness. And I read one magazine article that was titled The Epidemic of Loneliness. And so it had some results of some studies in there, and I researched some of this and did a little bit on my own, and came up with some interesting things. I discovered how many books have been written about loneliness, and there's lots of them. I haven't read that many. I've read two. Bowling Alone is one that was out some 20 years ago, and it talked about how the changing social structure in our culture, the lack of connection and the lack of community. Another one is a book by Sherry Turkle called Alone Together, and that focuses on how technology is impacting our sense of aloneness and our sense of loneliness. That's a very well-written book. Some of the studies, Cigna Insurance Company, a couple of years ago surveyed 20,000 people in the United States, and nearly 50% reported feeling lonely most of the time. I think it was like 47% or 48%. And it's interesting which age group scored the highest. You know, you might think it's those over 65 or something like that. The age group that scored the highest was actually the age of 18 to 37. And then the question of social media came to my mind, and you know, that's ideally the idea behind social media is we feel a sense of connection with other people. And yet, it would indicate that perhaps quite the opposite might be true in its impact. In a study of young adults, Americans aged 19 to 32, the top 25% of social media users were twice as likely to report being lonely as those that used it the least. So, it would indicate, and this is the work of Sherry Turkle as well, that would indicate that social media may give us contact in a virtual way, but it doesn't give us true community. It doesn't give us true connection, or at least that's the indication. I found that it can, if I have a connection with someone, a heart connection, social media can help maintain that. But it's not a substitute in my experience. And this loneliness is definitely not limited to Americans. There's been studies in Japan and in the United Kingdom, shows very similar results. 40% of all the British people surveyed reported their primary social contact was either their pet or their television. Loneliness is rampant in the UK as well as in the US. And recently, Theresa May, Prime Minister, created a ministry called the Ministry of Loneliness. And so the UK has a Minister of Loneliness. It's a cabinet-level position. So that issue is recognized, and it's so endemic that it got the government's attention. Loneliness is not just about emotions, it's also about our physical health. And 2010, Brigham Young University studied chronic loneliness, and they saw that in their research, it significantly decreases one's life span, about the same as smoking 3/4 of a pack of cigarettes every day, which is about 8 to 10 years. There's also those that reported to be lonely are much greater risk for many issues such as heart disease, stroke, cancer, and others. So it's an issue in which it's a social issue, it's a personal issue, it's a psychological issue. But from our perspective, I want to look at it as a spiritual issue as well. So I have categorized three types of loneliness, and this is my own categorization. I don't know if you'll find this anywhere else. But first of all, the most obvious is what I call circumstantial loneliness. This is when, for whatever reason, we're separated from people we love or someone we love. Someone dies or someone moves away or they're in the military or whatever. We're lonely because we're used to connecting with that person, or if we move, we get lonely, perhaps for our old neighborhood and our old friends and all of that. So that's a loneliness that is certainly on the increase in our culture, because our culture is more mobile and less stable and less family and neighborhood oriented. And, people live in big, huge, look like overgrown orange crates sometimes side by side with other people they don't even know, So that's on the rise, and it is one cause of loneliness. But usually circumstantial loneliness is temporary, particularly if a person's relatively healthy mentally, emotionally. It's just a matter of feeling the feelings and feeling the loneliness and the grief, and it will pass away. So after the person grieves and adjusts to the new environment, usually that's the end of that loneliness. There's another type of loneliness that's much more lingering. I call it psychological loneliness, and it's a loneliness that's chronic in the sense that it exists over a long period of time, typically, and it doesn't disappear with time. It doesn't go away. Even with meditation, doesn't take it away. Because the cause is in the past. The cause of this type of loneliness has to do with our development, our childhood, our family situation, growing up. And so when if there's been a lack of appropriate bonding or connection with parents, either because they're absent or impaired, or maybe they're just unable to bond with children or with other human beings. But we grow into adulthood, and we have kind of this feeling of a hole inside of us because something is missing. So psychological loneliness can be dealt with most effectively if we are willing to do some inner work, explore our history, look at what we're feeling, what was missing, and just uncover all of the feelings that have been lost or buried or memories that have been forgotten. It doesn't mean that we have to go into 30 years of psychoanalysis. When I use the term therapy, I mean that in a very general sense, that it can involve group work or journaling, or there's a whole number of different forms that it can take. But it does require that we take a look at what might have been missing in our early developmental stages that is contributing to sort of this constant aching or hole in the heart, as it might feel like. Because this type of loneliness is not remedied by simply being with people. You know, we can be more lonely in a crowd of people because the lack of contact is not a result of the present moment lack of contact, but it's from the past. And so having everybody on the planet love us isn't going to resolve that issue because it's inside of us. That needs to be looked at in that regard. But what I'd really like to focus on is a deeper sense of loneliness, third sense of loneliness that I might call existential loneliness or spiritual loneliness. And this form of loneliness is so common that it's generally considered normal, and it's not even seen as loneliness. It's not seen as an issue because it's a loneliness that arises out of a lack of connection or a lack of conscious connection with our own authentic self. The most painful form of loneliness is when we are disconnected from our own true nature, whether we call it Buddha nature or whatever you want to call it. But that essential nature that is what we really are, when that's missing, then we develop a false sense of self. And in that false sense of self, then we learn how to live in the world. We learn how to be functional. But we're living in that sense of profound disconnection from something that's real. And so that's what brings us to spiritual practice, many of us, is that realization that the life that I'm living and the life that I see other people living doesn't feel real. It feels like there's something missing. It feels very hollow, you see. And this sense, I think, is existent in virtually everyone. If we talk to anyone and ask them, are they truly deeply satisfied and happy all of the time? And people would say, well, of course not. They don't even realize that's a possibility to live connected with our true nature. And when we do, that changes everything. But first we have to deal with this existential loneliness, this feeling of being disconnected. It's so common, it's typically referred to as the human condition. You know, the human condition, that sense of emptiness, dissatisfaction. It's the first noble truth in Buddhism. When the Buddha said life is dukkha, life is suffering. He wasn't referring to everybody in the world is in pain and everybody in the world is weeping and moaning. The kind of dukkha is the kind of suffering that is inside, very deep and very pervasive. And it just becomes what we call normal, you see. So we all rise above it and pretend like we won't talk about it. You know, how are you today? Well, I'm just fine. How are you today? Well, I'm just fine too. And neither person or both persons know they're not being fully honest. And that's okay in our social contact to say that, but do we ever really meet at that level where we can say, I'm not so fine. There's something missing. Let's talk about that. Let's see if that's discoverable. So this primal, I'll call it a primal alienation, we typically develop a lot of defense mechanisms around it because it's painful and because we're taught to do that. You know, we don't see other people in our family and in our world talking about existential loneliness. They're talking about, you know, smiling and being happy and doing the right thing and all of that. So we don't have the support for looking at what's missing. You know, we're told to get over it or whatever, you know, look at count your blessings or whatever you have. And again, this doesn't mean that we have to walk around in glum face and misery, but it's simply recognizing that something's missing. And indeed, that's the first noble truth, and that's typically what brings us to spiritual practice, is when we strip away the denial and say something's missing. Kind of like in an AA program or a 12-step program, you know, I am an alcoholic or I have a problem, you know. So this form of loneliness can be dissolved, I think, only through some type of spiritual practice or spirituality, something that connects us with our deeper nature. And it's got, this form of loneliness has nothing to do with people. And again, we can be lonely in a crowd. There's a story, just a little bit of comic relief here, about a wise man that lived in India in a cave for many years. He was a hermit, and he spent most of his time meditating, but he was reputed to be extremely wise and very powerful spiritually. So there was one Westerner that was interested in meeting this man. And he was told, well, you got to really travel a long ways because he lives way high up on the mountain in the cave, and, you know, takes days and weeks to get there. And anyway, this intrepid Westerner found this man, crawled all the way up into his cave, and found the wise man, and he was meditating. And the Westerner looked in, and he very bare, Spartan surroundings, and he said, man, he said, hey, don't you get lonely up here all by yourself? And the wise man opened his eyes and he looked at the Westerner and he says, well, I wasn't until now. So ironically, the world can pull us can actually make us more lonely, because the world we live in oftentimes will encourage us to leave our true self and our authentic nature, to kind of rise above it, you see. And so yeah, the wise man wasn't lonely until he was distracted, until he was disconnected from the experience of his own true nature. So let's talk just very briefly about the practice working with loneliness. First of all, in this tradition, in the Buddhist tradition, loneliness is not seen as a problem, as it is in the Western psychological framework. In the practice, it's simply seen as another experience. So we recognize loneliness is present, or anger is present, or sadness is present, or joy is present, or whatever is present. And we see it. With emotions, it can be helpful to name them. If you can't, it's not a big deal. But if you can recognize loneliness, sadness, whatever is going on, just kind of develop a palette, if you will, for our feelings. And then just allow them to be present. When we don't resist our emotions, they immediately begin to change, transform. Then we recognize that loneliness is a problem and it causes suffering only if we're identified with the loneliness. So oftentimes with a feeling, any feeling, emotional feeling, it isn't just that I'm having this experience, but I am lonely, or I am angry, or I am this or that, you see. So when we're identified with it, that exacerbates that feeling enormously. So if we can bring awareness to the breath, to the body, notice the emotion, notice the sensations in the body, and then investigate it, explore it, not in an intellectual sense, but simply in the sense of what does it feel like? What sensations are connected with loneliness? Where do I feel that in my body? You know, what thoughts are connected with loneliness? So being aware of our thinking, our sensing, as we're aware of it, we're less identified with it. We can see it out there, so to speak. So recognizing it, allowing it, inquiring into it, and not identifying with it. The essence of loneliness or any emotion is that there's some story about it's got to do with something or someone out there. Loneliness is looking outward to try to fill something that can only be filled inward. So we always turn to our present moment experience. And we always start with the premise that everything that I need is right here, right now. So resting in that presence, being aware, opening and allowing, then loneliness can become the pathway to our own true nature. So by deeply tasting, exploring loneliness, not trying to fix it, but what is it? What is this? What's the reality of it? We can find loneliness itself as a vehicle for feeling a love, a connectedness, a reality that we were not even aware of before we begin our practice. So I'll close with this quote from one of my favorite teachers, Nisargadatta Maharaj, a well-known teacher. He said, instead of searching for what you do not have, find out what it is that you have and never lost. Instead of searching for what you do not have, find out what it is you have that was never lost and can never be lost. And so our true nature can never be lost. It is the ultimate reality. So I invite you to just take a moment, touch your heart, and I want to honor each and every one of you for the courage it takes to do this practice. But you're not alone. Buddha, Dharma, Sangha is with you, as well as within you. So thank you for sharing your practice with us this morning.